Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I'm your host, Josh Brom. I'm here again with Liz Goddard and everyone's new favorite person, Gabi Veers. Today's topic comes from a listener or a fan who posted on our wall and said this was a question that he was interested in our response to, and I thought, that's interesting. And I've spent the last several weeks trying to figure out what exactly that I think about this question. So here's our topic.
All right.
How much do pro-life advocates need to know about fetal development or embryology to be adequately prepared to talk to lots of pro-choice people?
How much do we need to know?
How much do you need to know to be prepared to talk to lots of pro-choice people? Because obviously there's sometimes conversations you don't spend very much time on the biology. If someone's making a bodily rights argument and they're like, oh yeah, it's totally a person, like we're probably not going to spend that much time on on embryology.
Right.
But if you're going to talk to a lot of pro-choice advocates, then the biology is going to come up semi-often. So that's kind of why I'm qualifying it that way. How much do pro-life people need to know to be adequately prepared to do a good job defending the pro-life position if they want to talk to a lot of pro-choice people? So let me get your kind of one or two sentence, just kind of broad brush, where are you at on this question? I'll give my answer and a couple of qualifiers.
I think where I'm at is that I think each pro-life person, if they're really taking their position seriously, should have a basic understanding. They obviously don't need to know enough that would be like an embryology textbook.
Right.
Sure.
But they need to have a basic understanding of what an organism is, what it means to be alive, and does the unborn meet these qualifications.
Awesome. Liz?
Yeah, and I would agree with some of those basic things. Obviously, the first and foremost thing, you've got to be able to make some kind of a claim that it's alive. Or, I mean, just a basic claim is fine. You know, we teach people just, is it growing? Yes, well, growing things are alive. That's a general principle that we can apply. You know, even a young child can understand that concept. Right. But I think going a step further and knowing some of the critical stages, I think it's important particularly to know when the heart starts beating. That's something that really strikes people, and it's something that, you know, might not be that relevant to value as far as it being a really critical landmark in development, but it's something that really strikes at the heart of people. And so when they know that somewhere between 21, 23 days in that general vicinity is when the heart starts beating, that moves a lot of people immediately from abortion is okay, you know, only in the late trimester, or abortion should be illegal only in the late trimester, moves them way back a lot of the time very quickly.
Right. Yeah. So my short answer is I think that I think we're in agreement that there are certain things that pretty much you got to know. So I've got this category that we're going to talk about, and you guys have now mentioned a few things that are in that category. Kind of like I'm just calling this the minimum. This is like what you if you want to be effective at this, I think you got to know these things. And then I've got the second category that's going to be like the if you want to be really good and take it another step, you know, then here are some other really helpful things that do come up sometimes. A few caveats before we get to that list, and I'm going to kind of kick this to you guys for kind of finishing. If there's other things that are in that minimum list, I'm going to ask you for that. My view is that there's not only there's a few things that you need to know, but also that you need to know enough about fetal development to not make false claims.
Yes.
So that's
I agree with that.
That's in my minimum category.
Yes, do not make things up, please. Don't guess.
If you're a sidewalk counselor or you work at a pregnancy care center as a counselor, I think this list is going to be very different for you. I'm not talking to sidewalk counselors. I think at that point you want to know as much as possible. I would say that for everybody. Obviously, the more you know, it can't hurt knowing more things. But I think what our show is kind of always been geared to is not pregnancy care center counselors or sidewalk counselors. It's been geared more towards people that are wanting to dialogue about abortion in their sphere of influence with, you know, on a college campus or with their friends. So that's kind of my caveat. You said something really important that should not be missed, Liz, which is that, or the implication. I'm gonna restate what you said, but I'm just gonna do it a little bit more clearly. We should not be making our argument that the unborn should not be killed because of what they can do functionally.
Right.
This is really, really important, and this happens a lot. It's like, it's got a heartbeat, so you shouldn't kill it. That's not my view. I don't want to make any argument where it's like, okay, you can't kill the unborn because they can do this or this or this. Although it is helpful to know what the unborn can do, you just got to be really careful the way you make your argument. Our argument is that the unborn are human beings just like you and me, and they're valuable. And there's no reason, there's no morally relevant difference between the unborn and us to make it so you can kill one and not the other. As Scott Klusner says, the embryo you once were is no different than the adult you are today. Okay, so let me kick it to you guys. Minimum category. What is it that, and you've already mentioned a few, what is it that pro-life advocates need to know if they're going to be effective in a lot of conversations about this?
I think we need to have a good understanding of when viability is. That's a lot of times that becomes an argument. Well, when can the baby live outside of the mother? And generally speaking, it's after what is it?
It's about 23 weeks is what I'm willing to say now.
But there have been a few cases earlier, right? We've gone as far as 19...
late in the 18th week.
Yeah.
Like
and so,
weeks,
but those are the very rare
That's
cases. Right. But 23 or 24 weeks is generally considered
pretty safe
for viability. And so knowing that that's not a set date, knowing that you can't just say, oh, it's 20 weeks old, that means it's viable, we could just do a C-section. That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
And so knowing how to use that and also how to be able to walk people back. Okay, well, this baby did survive at about 19 weeks. What if we were able to save them at 16 weeks, 17 weeks, and use that as a tool to show that viability doesn't matter? That's a matter of medical technology and how far advanced we are, and not a matter of how human the unborn is.
Yep, I think it's really good. I think viability comes up all the time. It's in Casey versus Planned Parenthood, and people say all the time, hey, when it's viable, it seems like then we should protect it, but it seems like it's like you've now picked a moving target. That seems, it seems
that's
like
a good way
weird
to put it.
line to draw. So I think that's really good. Just throw out anything else that you would put in the minimum list.
I think to understand what it means to be a whole living organism, that it's one thing for it just to be alive, and I think most people agree that it's alive, but so is your kidney. Your kidney has living tissue, and it's even living human cells. But what does it mean to be a whole organism? And I love
what does it mean? How do you explain it to people that say, well, this is just my skin cells are living tissue, and they kind of straw man the pro-life position, saying, oh, you're saying that it's wrong to kill all living human cells like embryos, and so you'd be against me, killing my somatic bodily cells. What do you say to them to help them understand the misstep they've made?
Right. I think the misstep they have made is that they've confused the parts versus the whole, and that when you're talking about a whole living organism, you have a organism that's organizing its parts for the good of the whole, and your skin cells are part of who you are. Your kidney cells are part of who you are, but the unborn is organizing its cells for the good of the whole, no matter what stage it's at.
Right. And one good way to point that out that's pretty clear to most people, especially in this age of CSI shows, is just to point out that from fertilization, you have a new unique DNA. And people associate DNA with a human organism. So when you talk about the fact that it's not just it is a combination of the mother and the father's DNA, but it's different, and it's its own unique DNA. That helps people sometimes distinguish between, it's this many cells from the mom and this many cells from the dad, to help clarify that you do have a whole organism with its own genetic fingerprint.
Right. I agree that's helpful. I think especially if they're saying, well, it's part of the mother's body, or it's the exact same. It's like, well, but it's got a different DNA fingerprint and different gender sometimes, and so what do you do with that? I think sometimes pro-life people use the DNA thing and make it like it's all about DNA and overstate what is about the DNA, and so I'm a little bit concerned about that. I probably don't know enough about it to say anything really, really helpful about it, but there's certainly more going on than just the DNA, and more research the last few years is suggesting that we've kind of thought of DNA as like the ultimate thing, and there's probably a lot of other things going on, and that's about all I know.
But it's something that clicks with people.
Yeah,
it's something that people
helpful.
can understand.
I think a helpful tool to put in the minimum box, it was something that I first learned when I first began to seriously consider the pro-life position, and that's the 10-second pro-life apologist that Steve Wagner came up with at Justice for All. And just 3 sentences, and you can even turn them into questions. It's helpful to memorize. I would take the time to memorize it. And that is, if something is growing, it must be alive. If it has human parents, it must be human. And humans, or living humans like you and I, are valuable, aren't they?
I agree. I use that, and like there's nothing, and like if I look at all the conversations that I have on abortion, there's nothing else I say more often in more of the conversations than that. I use that in probably somewhere right around 70-80% of my conversations, and I think it's really helpful. But I think it's not enough for the minimum. I'm with you. I think you also need to defend that it's an organism.
Right.
At least understanding the distinction between parts and wholes, that is crucial. That comes up all the time. Oh, you just think that sperm are sacred. No, that's not our view.
Right.
And so being able to explain parts versus wholes, I think is huge. I think also knowing enough about fetal development not to refer to the unborn as like potential humans.
Oh, yes.
That's not our view.
Yes.
That, if you just leave it alone, it'll become a human, later. It's like, no.
Biologically speaking.
Right.
Yeah.
And we don't think that philosophically either. So I think need to be careful about that. You guys have listed everything on my list. Knowing that it's alive because it's growing, knowing that it's got human parents, and parts versus wholes, those were kind of the key on my list. And then the other thing, before we move to the other category, unless you think of something else, you can throw it in. But I think, and this goes back to something I said before, this does fall into the minimum category. Knowing enough to not make faulty or false claims about fetal development, and this happens all the time, and so a few things about I think what you could do to learn about this, like you go to ehd.org, a wonderful fetal development website. It's got these videos that National Geographic has now used. Their embryology videos. It's very, very scientifically accurate. It's like the best fetal development videos that are out there. If you went through all those videos once or twice, you would kind of learn enough. You kind of get the broad sense of kind of what's going on. If you go and watch National Geographic's In the Womb, you get this idea of what's going on in this arc of fetal development. Enough to know, not to say that a first trimester embryo has this very intimate emotional relationship with the mother and can feel pain and is sentient and.
I don't know if that comes from research or if that just comes from having humility not to make something up on the fly. Because even if you do know a lot, I think sometimes there can be that temptation to make things up when you have a gap in your knowledge. And I think part of that's just personal character.
And we shouldn't do that too. I think sometimes it's like we want to make an emotional argument because it's way easier than making a really carefully nuanced logical argument too. But also I think there's some people that they actually think that.
Well, right, or they don't know. I mean, something about like when they can feel pain. When can the unborn feel pain? That's kind of a disputed topic. There's not a settled age. And I've heard people just say, oh, well, that's at this many weeks, and so the nervous system's developing, so the unborn can feel pain at that point. And they might not have enough backed up knowledge to make that statement. And it's the same thing when you look at brain waves. That's something that is very commonly indicated on a chart of fetal development. Here's where we can first detect brainwaves.
On pro-life charts of fetal development,
yes,
you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it'll be listed as this is where brainwaves start. But it's really, that's when we can detect brain activity, brain waves, and not necessarily when the unborn can start thinking.
Well, I'm gonna have to refute you now.
Oh, okay, take me on.
Okay, so here's the thing: is I'm not convinced, even though most pro-life people are, and there is this quote that people have been using for decades. I'm not convinced that we can actually detect brain waves from a 40-day embryo because we don't have the equipment to do that. You would have to put electrodes on a tiny embryo, and you physically can't do it.
So tell me why that is on a pro-life field development chart at 40 days. How does someone arrive to that conclusion?
Because there's a pro-life book that was written a long time ago by a wonderful man who I'm not going to name that quoted another guy from the 60s saying that 40-day embryos have detectable brain waves, and it wasn't double-checked or triple-checked. And now I think since then we've quoted that. I think when we look, here's the other thing though, and there's a lot of work that can be done on this. I don't want to overstate my case.
Sure.
I'm not saying 40-day embryos don't have brain waves or brain activity. Right. I'm saying we can't detect them. But when you look at the way 6-7 week embryos act, it can be logically inferenced that they might have some kind of brain activity because of the way that they move. So they might. Once again, it doesn't matter, but I definitely don't want to say there's detectable, because that's the way pro-lifers say it. There's detectable brain waves at 40 days, and I've got a friend that's done a ton of research on this. This is like, it's not, we should never say that.
So a more safe thing to say is, one, maybe not even point to brain waves, otherwise indicate that it appears at this stage that there's enough activity in the fetus that we can presume that there's maybe some brain activity.
Yeah, there's some
or
brain activity
development.
probably by 7 or 8 weeks. We just don't have a lot. We can say that. A perfect example of this is there's this really, I wrote an article last year on Live Actions Blog because they asked me to do a review of, no, it was this year. Never mind. We're late in 2012. Feels like last year. They asked me to do a review of this movie, To Be Born, this wonderful, really well-produced pro-life short movie. I did an interview with the director, and I watched it, and I liked a lot of things about it, but what I didn't like was that it implied a lot of things that are not true about fetal development. And they've agreed, and they were really nice about it, but they implied that a 2 to 4 week embryo can hear, can cry, is able to feel fear, able to feel pain. And it's like, well, you can probably hear about 16 weeks. You can cry about 20 weeks. You can feel fear about 18 weeks. And pain, that's the really disputed one.
Sure.
Definitely by 20 weeks, maybe as early as 14 weeks, according to a guy that's been doing a lot of research on it lately. And that they have conscious thoughts. It's like, no, there's no way. So we want to be really careful.
Right. So what we can glean from all of that is that if you don't know and you haven't researched enough to develop a well-reasoned opinion, stay away from those issues because you're liable to get in trouble if you make a statement that you think is factual and somebody else has more knowledge than you, and all of a sudden you've been refuted and you've lost some of your credibility.
Yeah, and trying to, if you're gonna make a strong claim to something, like go and check your sources. I wouldn't only source pro-life websites. I've been burned several times by this, by quoting like an organization that in general I really, really respect, but maybe they missed something, and then I find out the hard way from a listener after I published some video of me saying it.
So what would be a non-pro-life website that you could recommend?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for you.
Well, National Geographic's In the Womb would be a great place to start because you're talking about a neutral, definitely not sectarian, not pro-life by any means, but well-respected.
EHD.org is great. EHD.org is non-religious. They've got sources for just about everything that I've seen on there. So places like that would be good. Like if we're looking for neutral places.
And what does EHD stand for?
Exactly what I
don't remember, but I'm going to look it up before the end of the show.
Think embryo human development.
Thanks for Google. It's a neutral party. Looking at embryology textbooks, like all these things, those can be helpful. Okay, so let's move on. So that would be the minimum category. What is better? If you want to, if you're like, okay, I already know all that stuff, I want to get really good at this. What are some other things that we haven't mentioned before that are good for pro-life advocates to know?
I think maybe if you're able to reference some more scientific articulations of it, like maybe if you could find a quote from an embryology textbook,
like Oberhelia and Mueller, for example.
That one would be great. Even Richard Stith's article, Construction and Development.
So you guys are taking all of mine. That was Richard Stith's thing was on my understanding.
His is great, and he takes the time to really develop the idea of the difference between parts versus wholes. And
no, I don't think Stith is doing parts versus wholes. Stith is explaining the difference between development and construction. And that's really and that's important. Like I didn't put that in the minimum category because it doesn't come up that often. But for some people, in fact, usually it would come up because we bring it up. Because what Stith says is that this is why pro-choice people think you're all crazy. Because they think that the unborn is constructed like a car, and no one thinks that as soon as two pieces of steel are bolted together at the beginning of the construction line that you've got a car. But they hear us say life begins at conception. They're like, what? Like that seems weird, and then so he explains the difference.
That's one of the things I think that draws people to the heartbeat starting or brain waves or something like that, is they're drawn to drawing the line there because they think that's the part that was added that matters. And so having a good knowledge of the difference between being constructed with parts being added and actually developing from within yourself becomes very helpful to clarify, okay, well, why is the heart important to you? And figuring, okay, well, that I think that makes it seem more human to me. Okay, well, do you understand that the heart's not added at this point, that it is the same cells are developing, and backtrack a little bit? That can be really helpful to move on from those sticking points.
So what Stith says is that the unborn is developed more like a Polaroid photo, and I think Stephanie Gray does the best job of explaining the story. So like imagine if you're on Lake
Loch
Ness.
Yes.
All right, it's getting in trouble by starting with lake. Loch Ness,
It's
and
not
you
a lake,
get a
it's in
Polaroid picture
Scotland.
of the Loch Ness monster, and then your friend in the boat takes a look at it. It's like, oh, you didn't get it. It didn't turn out, and then rips up the picture and throws it in the lake.
No.
Like, you would be really, really frustrated because you did have a picture of it. You just couldn't see it yet. It hadn't finished developing yet, but everything that was needed was already there. That's what we think the unborn is like. So knowing that, like, you might detect that the pro-choice person you're talking to is really incredulous about what you think about the biology, and it might be this. They might not be able to articulate it. No one's like, well, I think it's constructed like a car, but that is what they think. And if you can help them understand this, that can be really helpful.
I think another thing that can be very helpful that's a little bit beyond the basics is knowing what the scientific signs of life are. And knowing, well, you know, when we're talking about scientifically what life is, we're talking about whether or not something's growing through cellular reproduction, it's metabolizing food for energy, it's responding to stimuli, and which one am I missing?
Right.
Am I missing one?
Metabolism.
That's the three. Metabolism, metabolizing food
Converting
for energy.
food to energy. Yeah. So yeah, knowing those things I think can be helpful. But if as long as you know growth, that's like, because dead things
Right.
don't
Well,
grow,
we're talking
so
about what's
that
more
helps.
beneficial.
That's right.
Moving on from the basics, that's something that can be
helpful.
helpful when somebody's trying to make some kind of a claim that, you know, just being growing, or you know, maybe they're arguing a little bit more with the scientific. They're not taking just your word for it. You can say, well, okay, well, here's our scientific qualifications for what life is.
Right.
And this is what we've established through, you know, scientific fields, and that's helpful if you want something additional.
And you know, there's a third. We haven't mentioned the third argument that JFA, Justice for All, teaches people to defend the organism idea. But I think this is also helpful. We've talked about the parts versus wholes, which is that's the most important. You gotta know that one.
Right.
Then there's the Richard Stith, and you can just Google Richard Stith and abortion. The article comes up. It's very, very helpful on construction versus development. But then also the idea that it's like, you know, if you're an organism, well, then the unborn is an organism too. There's no essential difference biologically between the way that you work and embryos. But I think there's other things. I think knowing that the unborn can hear around 17, 18 weeks. I think for some people that's really helpful, because some people say, oh yeah, it's completely like in a coma-like state until 39 weeks. Well, that's not really true. I don't want to overstate like what the unborn can do, but I don't want to like act like they're in a coma the whole time either, like they respond to the
I
voice.
think what you're getting at is that each of those things, like whenever we state that there is a level of development that the unborn has reached, is we're humanizing the unborn for the person we're talking to, and it's helpful. It may not be what's critical biologically, like, or you know, having a heart added may not change your worth as a human, but we're helping people understand that, okay, no, this is not a blob of tissue.
Right.
Or it is a blob of tissue in the same way that you and I are a blob of
Right.
tissue.
Right.
Or a blob of cells. And I think it can be very helpful.
Did you mean, I just want to clarify, I think I know what you meant, but I just want to clarify. Did you mean that it's not maybe as important philosophically as far as the
Right.
value? You said biological. Because, yeah, I completely agree. So if you can, I was talking to Steve Wagner about this today, and kind of his view is like, hey, yeah, you're going to talk about, you know, there's maybe 30% of people that you only need to do kind of this quick common ground, 10-second pro-lifer is kind of all you need. But for the other 60, 70%, you got to also be able to go to that organism stage, and then there's these other things that can be helpful. But then, so now that we've clarified that, before we end, then let's kind of explain this next step. Because if you can establish this biological common ground, what do you do when the person says, okay, fine, I agree? In fact, some people might do this because they know you know more about the biology than they do. So they might be like, okay, if you're going to give me the chance to go for a different pro-choice argument, I'm going to take a right here, and we're going to head to the philosophy. So when they say, okay, fine, I'm with you, it's biologically a whole human living organism, which is what we're saying, it's a living human organism. But they say it's not a person yet. Let's just spend a couple of minutes giving a brief 101 on what we say when we get into from the biology to the philosophy.
So they've made the claim that it's not a person yet.
Yeah.
My number one go-to is, what is a person? You know, what is the difference between a human being and a person? They're the one making the claim. They have the burden of proof. And then that's where they're going to probably bring up one of the 4 differences between us and the unborn. And that would be what we refer to as SLED, which is size, level of development, their environment, and their degree of dependency. And each of those things individually we can compare with other human beings to show that that difference doesn't matter.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean that the difference doesn't matter?
Well, looking at size, a lot of times people bring up, obviously at different stages of development, the unborn's the size of a grain of rice.
Right.
And that's a big deal to people. That doesn't seem the right type of human. Yes, whatever, I agree with you. Human cells, human parents, whole organism, I get it. But that type of human is not going to be the type that's valuable.
Right.
And so you're going to take them at their word. Okay, it sounds to me like you're making a claim that size or how large we are determines how valuable we are. I'm going to point to a human being that we value, like a baby, like an infant that's already born, or pull out a jockey as opposed to a basketball player, right, and ask them if those individuals who are smaller are less valuable than the larger individuals. And of course the answer is going to be no. And so the issue no longer is size. The issue is going to be something else.
Okay, so we're saying that there are these differences. The four
they're definitely
differences.
There. Don't deny them.
I completely agree. But they're not morally relevant because
Right.
it doesn't seem like we say that matters after birth. So it seems like, why would that matter before birth? Okay, so
Right.
then I think the next question that comes up, and this is what we can do in the last couple of minutes of the show: why are humans valuable in the first place?
Well, that depends on
Gabi?
your metaphysics.
What do you mean by that, Gabi?
What I mean is that how you determine whether or not humans have value depends on a lot of other beliefs. If you believe that we are a product of random chance, or if you believe that there was a being who created us and assigned us special value. And so the two basic, I think, arguments could be, one, that we're valuable because there's a God and he has assigned a special value, we're made in his image. The other belief would be that we're valuable because we have things like consciousness or rationality, we have abstract thought, we have an ability to reason morally, and that's what makes us valuable or different from animals.
Yeah, I think all of that's really helpful. You can also, if you want to go a completely different direction, you can use the Don Marquis argument that we're going to do a whole show on one of these days, the future like ours argument, that it seems like if it's wrong to kill young people because they have a future like ours, and it seems, why wouldn't it also be wrong to kill the unborn for that same reason? It's not, it doesn't work for everybody. It wouldn't tell you why it's wrong to kill old people or babies that are really disabled, but it is helpful in the sense that it seems like it's a sufficient condition for it being wrong to kill someone, just not a necessary one. EHD stands for the Endowment for Human Development. So I would recommend people go to ehd.org. This is the best field development website I've ever seen or heard of, and you can use this website to become a more effective advocate for the unborn. That's our show. Have a great week.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.